If there's one thing that summarizes the work of a web designer, it would be, how does this design look in multiple browsers? Now, of course, there's more to being a web designer than just that, because as a web designer, you need to know the ins and outs of the various web technologies that you use. But there tends to be a bottleneck around the issue of browsers. So whether we like it or not, we have to consider the question of browsers if we want our designs to be successful and reach the largest audience possible. And to that end, we really need to address some aspects of those browsers before we get too far into learning more about the specifics of CSS. As I mentioned before, we can control how HTML looks with CSS, but it's really the browser, and more specifically the browser's interpretation of the CSS rules and style information, that determines the real result. Now, the browser is a very, very powerful piece of software. There's a lot of things that go into that browser to make it work. And more often than not, the browser does pretty amazing things, and things just work. Now, of course, there are times where sometimes our designs don't quite work appropriately in one set of browsers, whereas it works perfectly in another browser. Now, the difference between these browsers is more or less their rendering engine. The rendering engine is the software that takes the HTML and CSS code and translates it to some type of visual display. The different browser companies have built their browsers by looking at the standards that have been set up by the W3C, as well as looking at what worked in the past. Now, if you look at the history of HTML, you end up seeing that your different browser companies at one point in time were developing proprietary HTML tags that only worked inside of that browser. So whenever you're working with these browsers, sometimes these browsers are going to have kind of weird things going on with them because they may have conflicting information about how to handle some of these different styles and tags. To the degree that a browser maintains the compliance to a standard is the degree to which web designers will accept, appreciate, and promote that particular browser. So, in general terms, web designers tend to target the browsers that are known to be compliant with the standards defined by the W3C. This breakdown is by no means a definitive breakdown of all the browsers that are available, because anybody can really create a browser if they spend the time to do so. However, these are the most compliant and most popular browsers that are available. First of all, there is Firefox. Firefox runs on the Gecko rendering engine. Now, not only does Firefox run on that, but also most of your other Mozilla-based clients, including Mozilla, SeaMonkey, and so forth. Next, we have Safari. Safari runs on the WebKit engine. Now, the WebKit engine is also implemented in Google's Chrome browser, and it's a good standards-compliant rendering engine as well. Next, we have the Opera browser, which runs on the Presto rendering engine, and the Presto rendering engine is a nice standards compliant engine as well. Lastly, we have the most popular browser, which is Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer runs on the Trident rendering engine or the MS-HTML engine. In general, all of our different browsers end up becoming more and more standards compliant as time progresses. Now, some of your older versions of some of these browsers are not necessarily standards compliant, and some of them have a lot of different bugs in those legacy versions. If you do need to code for some of those legacy browsers, it's going to be considered a good practice for you to focus on what the design looks like for one of the above modern standards compliant browsers, so that you can make sure your design looks good according to standards, and then you can go back and figure out how to make it work for other browsers. Now, of course, those issues with the other browsers are considered to be browser-based CSS-related bugs. It's not necessarily something wrong with CSS, it's just that the browser does not implement CSS according to the standard. What that ends up meaning is that you will design to the standard and then spend a lot of time trying to work around the different bugs that your legacy browsers have with CSS implementation. Essentially, these are going to be known as your workarounds and hacks, and when you need to do this, I do recommend that you take a look around the internet for browser hacks and workarounds for the specific browser and version that you're needing to target. And so that concludes this movie on different browsers and how they are going to be using our CSS standards.